Good morning, students, and welcome to Tuesday, right? So we're continuing our work with our character analysis, have some good writing. We did our introduction yesterday. We'll get to our body paragraphs today. But first, the joke. What did one hat say to the other? Because hats can talk, apparently. You stay here, I'll go on ahead. Not ahead, but ahead. So the difference between one word and two words. See, spelling and grammar do matter. It does. It matters. I'll go on ahead. Okay. So this video is a little bit longer as I'm going to get into the body paragraphs and what you should do to write an awesome body paragraph. Again, I'll have a live class today at 10 if you want to talk further. Otherwise, just sit back and watch this explanation of body paragraphs and then focus today on one or two body paragraphs and you should be in good shape. Of our character analysis. This is in Google Classroom. So we go into Google Classroom, we click on classwork, and it is under the reading. It's called the character analysis. So we open it up there. Yesterday we worked on our introduction, and as we wrote our introduction, we said that we needed to have a few things in there. Okay, for starters, we had to have a hook or a lead. Then we needed to have the title of the book and the author's name. We needed to include the character's name with a brief explanation of him or her, some background info into the book, and then lastly having a claim or a thesis. So important that we have that in our introduction. Then today we are going to start looking at our body paragraphs, the evidence in here. Okay, and so when we look at our body paragraphs, the first thing that we want to do is we want to include what's called a transition into the body paragraphs. We can't just jump right into them. So when we look here, right, some transition words or phrase that we could use are words or phrases that connect or tie different ideas together smoothly. So a good way to support a topic sentence is to use transition words. So as we are transitioning, moving into our first body paragraph, we want to have a sentence that leads into that. For example, we could have something that says, first of all, we see an example of this character trait in the beginning of the book. Or we could say, for example, here is a situation in the book where we see this character trait. So we want to have some of these transitions that can lead us into it. Another way of looking at transitions is these have a few more sentences in there, right? So you could go after your introduction and say, a brief example of this can be found early on in the book. Or you could go on and say, at the beginning, we could see that. Or we could have a sentence that says, let's move on to another example. Later on in the story, my character blank. And so we want to have a sentence at the beginning that kind of leads us into it. This page here gives us a good look at some different ways, different words that we could do. So we could say something like, obviously, this was important to the character. We see the importance of this when... Or we could use additional words here to transition. Moreover, we can find more examples of this character trait later on in the book. And so any of these words, if you're stuck on how to begin a paragraph, think about these words and how we can bring those in. Okay, I will put these into Google Classroom as well. So good transition words to get into that body paragraph. Then, as we look at the body paragraph, that's where we are really going to prove our point, right? So if you remember, we talked about our body paragraphs being something like a burger, right? So I tried to draw an example of a paragraph burger. As you can see, not the best. In fact, it's pretty terrible. I don't know what I was doing. I'm not an art major or an art teacher. That's good. But when we look at it, we think about it, our body paragraphs really need to function like a paragraph burger. So here, let me go into a little more details with that. Good paragraph burger, right? Think of this bun on the top as like the topic sentence, right? It includes the transition, which is leading us into it. Then we have the meat, which is going to be the details, the evidence. We have our explanation in the commentary, which is all of this extra stuff in here that makes it amazing. And then we've got the concluding sentence down at the bottom, right? So you want a big, solid burger in there that's really set up well and it's explained well. This document here does a nice job of really explaining it, right? The infamous paragraph burger. Okay, so your argument, your claim, your topic sentence is the top bun. Then, as you're going, right, you have a little bit of evidence, quote from the text, example from the book. This can go a long way. So finding an example and using that is huge, right? Then the middle part here, I like how this breaks down and says this is the most important part, right? Your analysis is this, and this, right? If that looks like most of the paragraph, it's because it is, right? Evidence is important. However, your analysis and your explanation is even more important. So make sure that you include your explanation of why that example fits. And then we've got the bottom bun that relates it back to the top. So as you are writing, think of your body paragraphs as a burger, right? Have a topic sentence with a transition. You've got an evidence or an example from the book, and then explain why that's important, how that fits, and then kind of conclude your sentence and wrap up leading into the next one. So paragraph burger, transitions, evidence, here we go. So if we look at the example, right, we have our claim. From beginning to end, Victor undergoes a lot of change. He grows physically and mentally into a man. So let's look at the first body paragraph. As the story began, there's a good example of a transition. Victor would think twice about his actions, so they're setting it up. He would always like to stay on the safe side, so giving some background into what's happening with the character in the book. Then we have actual evidence. For instance, the book gets this across to the reader on page 3 when it states, now we've got a direct evidence right here, comma, quote, probably should have capitalized this. Unlike Rico, I was afraid of rattlesnakes. Again, should be capitalized here. It's too murky to be crawling in here, I told him. Then we have parentheses, author's name, page number. So this is called in-text citation. So 8th graders, this is something that we should be pretty familiar with. 6th graders, we're just learning this, so you can kind of play around with it. 7th graders, we've done it a little bit. Whenever you give an exact line-for-line quote from the book, you want to put it in quotation marks, and then afterwards, you want to put parentheses, the author's name, and the page number. So we give some evidence from there, and now is the important part, the explanation. This portion of the text does clarify that Victor is not very brave. He doesn't have enough courage to risk losing it all, but he has no choice. Therefore, he begins his expedition to cross the border illegally to America and begins to change. So again, set it up with a transition, gave some background info, gave an actual quote from the book, so the evidence inside of quotation marks, and then explained. Let's go down to our other example. So when we were talking about touching Spirit Bear, right? The claim here was that Cole changed into a better person. So how does this body paragraph work? Here's a transition. At the beginning of the book, Cole was always full of rage and anger. So they go on to explain that rage and anger and some explanations there. Then they give an actual quote. Cole says on page 7, comma quotes, "You're a dead man." Okay, he could have had the author's name afterwards in parentheses, but left it off. So there's evidence there, and then there's explaining it. There's even another piece of evidence. And so making sure we're really explain. Okay, so as you think about your body paragraphs, they don't need to be super long, again, 5 to 9 sentences, but think of them as that paragraph burger, right? Set it up with the topic sentence or the transition. Explain what's going on a little bit, give an example from the book, and then explain how that example fits back to your claim. Everything should always be tied back to your claim, whatever was at the end of your introduction. Okay? So your goal today, right? Write at least one body paragraph. So by the end of today, you should have your introduction and at least one body paragraph that you are rolling through. All right, how appropriate that Mr. DeMarais has now become a burger. As you write your paragraph burger, you want to make sure that it is amazing, that you've got good evidence in there, that you're explaining it, and you're doing a great job, okay? So after today, we should have our introductions and at least one body paragraph. Keep writing, keep rolling throughout the week, and maybe go have a burger or a veggie burger or something, you know? Have a great week.